My name is Kristen Vega. I'm the Program Associate at California Humanities, and I just want to welcome you to this conversation, The Electoral College, What Were the Founders Thinking? Very auspicious title, and the timing is about right with tomorrow's inauguration. We're also wanting to extend our deep thanks to the Mellon Foundation, which has supported this initiative through their Why It Matters funding, which is a months-long initiative to talk about electoral engagement in 48 states across the country right now. California Humanities is the State Humanities Council. We're a partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And this series will be going on through April, so stay tuned and we hope to see you at future programs. And now I'll hand it over to Dan Schnur.
And Kristen, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us for what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation about a critically important topic. That is, of course, the history, the current challenges, and the future of the Electoral College. I've been entrusted with two tasks on tonight's panel, by far the easiest tasks. The second of which is to ask really smart questions of our panelists, who I'll introduce to you in just a second. And the other is to provide just a brief historical overview of the Electoral College to set the context for this discussion. Let me start out though, before that historical overview, let me introduce my colleagues, those who are joining us tonight. First, we're very, very lucky to have Sonja Diaz. Sonja is the founding director of UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. She co-founded the first multi-issue policy think tank focused on Latinos in the University of California. And our timing being fortunate at what it was, in a previous life, Sonja served as a chief legal counsel to then California Attorney General Kamala Harris. And perhaps given the events of the next 18 hours or so, we can pick her brain on that professional relationship before we call it a night.
Not a chief legal counsel. You're giving me like a nice C-suite gig, but yes, was able to work with the vice president-elect.
So I stand corrected. My longtime friend, Karthick Ramakrishnan. Karthick is a professor of public policy and political science at the University of California, Riverside, and he's the founding director of the university's Center for Social Innovation. Karthick is currently working on projects relating to racial equity and philanthropy and regional development. And he's also done a lot of thinking and writing recently on the subject of federalism, the relationship between the federal and state governments, and on the changing role of news media in our society. And then finally, last but not least, is my friend Mindy Romero. And Mindy is the founder and the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the University of Southern California, Sacramento campus. Mindy's research focuses on political behavior and race and ethnicity, and her work seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the United States. So Mindy, Karthick, Sonja, we're very, very happy to have you with us tonight, this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. All right, so let's talk for just a minute about the Electoral College, and then we'll get to questions for our smart panelists. As anybody who would take the time to sign up for a program like this knows, the United States of America, for any number of reasons, does not select its president by a pure popular vote. And the reason for that, if you go back and look at the discussion had among our founders back in the 18th century, is not to put too fine a point on it. Our founders did not want our country to be a democracy, which we are not. Rather, we are a republic, which another way of describing is an indirect democracy. The reason for that, some having to do with education of the electorate, some having to do with the difficulty of communications and transportation back in the 18th century, and some having to do with a good old-fashioned elitism. Our founders did not believe that many Americans could be equipped to make the best choice possible in selecting their president of the United States. Now, keep in mind, this is an era, like I said, in which many Americans did not have a great deal of schooling. Technology did not allow them to access the conversations led and held by the candidates for office. And so what the founders decided would be a compromise is, rather than having the voters pick the president, and rather than simply having elected representatives, in this case, the Congress, pick the president for the voters, they saw the Electoral College as somewhat of a compromise. And as the years passed, every state decided to let the voters choose the electors who would represent their interests in the Electoral College. But the founders of our country wanted the voters to have a voice, but were concerned but were also very wary about elitism. They had just overthrown King George III. They were concerned that a president of the United States could turn into a monarch also. And so thought that having the House of Representatives, or the United States Congress, making that decision would be depriving the citizens of a role in the process. So for 240 years now, what we've had is a compromise that gives the voters a role in the process, but not an all-encompassing role. And in recent years, as our country has become more and more divided, not just by race, not just by gender, not by age, but most relevant in this context, as we become more and more divided into rural and urban communities, the Electoral College has begun to present somewhat of a skew when it comes to making our final decisions. And what we'll do tonight with Sonja, with Mindy, with Karthick, is we'll talk through both the positive aspects of that indirect process, but also the potential downsides of it. One last point I'll make, and then we'll get to questions, is all of you know, since the turn of the century in the year 2000, there have been no fewer than 3 presidential elections in which one party's candidate won the popular vote and the other party's candidate won the electoral vote. And so it's very easy to look at this and think of this as a purely partisan exercise. If Democrats, Al Gore, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, oh my gosh, I misspoke. Of course, Joe Biden won the Electoral College. What was I thinking? We should certainly know that this afternoon. What I meant to say, I apologize, is in 2 cases, both the Bush-Gore race in 2000 and the Clinton-Trump race in 2016, we had 2 instances, not 3, where the Democratic candidate won a majority of the popular vote and the Republican candidate won the Electoral College. So it is easy to think of this in a purely partisan way, but I'll offer you just one fact to consider before we move on to our conversation. In the year 2004, when George W. Bush ran for re-election against then Massachusetts Senator John Kerry lost the state of Ohio by roughly 80,000 votes, less than 1% of the margin in that state. If John Kerry had won 80,000 more votes in Ohio and carried that state in 2004, George W. Bush would have won the popular vote in that election, and John Kerry would have won the Electoral College. And so that, I think, would help us think about this in less partisan terms. The good thing about our panelists tonight is, while Karthick, Mindy, and Sonja all have very, very strong opinions, ideologically and philosophically, all of them are respected academics, and we're going to have a phenomenal conversation about how the Electoral College works, how it doesn't work, and what would make it work better. So enough of that. Karthick, let's get started. What do you say? First question to you. So on face value, the Electoral College attempts to balance the representation of high population and low population states. And this was one of the original compromises that the founders made, because the smaller states wouldn't have joined a union if they thought the large states, New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia, were going to rule them. So this created an incentive for the smaller states to participate by giving them a little bit of an extra bump in terms of Electoral College representation. Given that that's happened, given that we give that weighting to the smaller states now, 200 plus years later, Can you help us understand a little bit, what are some of the intentional and unintentional outcomes of that compromise between large and small states? And how does that affect the process geographically and demographically?
Thank you, Dan, and certainly we'll also, I'll take one take at it, and especially looking over to Sonja, who I think has a lot to say on this topic, and Mindy to weigh in as well. Thank you, everyone, for and especially Cal Humanities for creating this opportunity, and Dan for your excellent, setting the stage and for the moderation to come. I think one of the things we should recognize, and it's important to recognize, is to bring race and inequality into this conversation, not only now, but in the founding moment, right? So we can't talk about the Electoral College without the 3/5 compromise. And so it was not just about large states and small states, but slaveholding states and the kind of power that they would project. Now, it's not just about the Electoral College. You can talk about the US Senate, you can talk about the 3/5 compromise. But I think we would be remiss not to recognize that race was relevant even back then, even if it was not explicitly talked about in the context of the Electoral College, and certainly plays a role now. And now what it means when you have rural areas that are overrepresented, smaller states that are overrepresented. But let's also remember there are a bunch of states, small states, rural states like Vermont, that play a very marginal role in the Electoral College because of political parties. So really what the Electoral College is doing is sharply increasing the power of a certain number of states that for various reasons are very split politically. And you might say, well, that means that we're going to have centrist politics dominate, and it hasn't actually borne out that way. What it also creates the opportunities is for interests in particular kinds of populations in particular states receiving a lion's share of attention by incumbent administrations as well as campaigns, and relegates millions, tens if not hundreds of millions of people to the sidelines when it comes to a presidential election. And so that, that's really, if we think about the various challenges that our democracy faces, it's having significant numbers of young people, people of color, but even everyone else who are voting eligible and voters in states that where the results are even close, large or small, that are, maybe it's going too far to say that they're disenfranchised, but they definitely matter very little for campaigns, and to the extent that incumbent administrations worry about re-election, they matter very little for governance. If an incumbent administration is worried about getting re-elected. So I'll take that as an initial stab and leave it to my colleagues to say more.
Well, that's perfect. And Karthick, I will be eager to come back to you in a little bit and talk about potential ways that we can address those concerns.
Sure.
And before I bring Sonja into this conversation, I do want to go back to a point that Karthick made. I was remiss in my introduction in not mentioning, as Karthick to his credit did, the compromise not just between small states and large states, but as he correctly pointed out, the critically important, potentially necessary, and we'll talk about that more today, the compromise between slave states and free states. And of course, just like the small states wouldn't have joined the Union if they felt that their voices would have been overwhelmed by Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, slave states, it's been argued, would not have joined the Union had the slaves residing in those states not counted as 6/10 of a person in order to give the Southern slaveholding states a disproportionate voice in those discussions. More on that later, but Sonja, geographically, demographically, and culturally, where's that compromise brought us?
Yeah, I think it's important, to set the historical stage, which you both alluded to, which is that the number of electors is determined by the number of House and Senate representatives each state has. That goes back to this abhorrent part of our history and our Constitution, which is the 3/5 compromise. At the time that the Electoral College was decided, there was equanimity between the North and the South. However, in the South, there was a large proportion of the population that was unable to not only vote, but to be seen as a full human being. And that's where we get the Electoral College, is to really safeguard the South's potential to choose the next president. And these outcomes, by and large, have been telling. If we look historically, Thomas Jefferson won because of this Electoral College negotiation, and he got so many votes from the Southern states. There was a law review article from Cardozo Law School that said, what would it have meant if Jefferson's opponent, who was against slavery, would have won during the Louisiana Compromise? So our history was really shaped again and again by slavery. And let's remove history and think about democracy. And so getting to where we're at today, Dan, I think some of the intentional outcomes of this are at a time we had fair representation, right? This was supposed to be seemingly fairer for white men back in the day. But we know that it was not fair because we know we had the 3/5 compromise, but we also know that in the era after Reconstruction, the Jim Crow South, many Black people were unable to vote. And in fact, some Latino activists would argue that Latinos were not fully able to vote until Section 203, which helped language minorities, for whom California has so many Asian and Latino language minorities, meaning they're limited English proficient. And they then were entitled to access to a ballot in, their language, depending on population. There were all these revisions to really get to fair representation. And it's a struggle that we're continuing in the modern era because of the Supreme Court in Shelby County, but also all of the stuff we've seen this 2020 election cycle. So to your question, what were the demographic and geographic considerations? I think it sits squarely on race.
Thank you very much, Sonja. And I do want to come back to you, just like to Karthick, to talk a little bit about steps to be taken going forward. But I want to bring Mindy Romero into this conversation, because I told all of you at the beginning that we wanted to talk about both the upsides and the downsides of the Electoral College. And so, Mindy, understanding the shortcomings that we've heard Karthick and Sonja talk about, can you speak to the question about why it would make sense to keep the Electoral College in place going forward?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me tonight. So, there's a number of arguments, some held up today, still quite frequently, and others not so much. So I'm going to go through just a quick list and then elaborate on a few that I think we hear about a little more frequently and are still part of the dialogue around the Electoral College and whether to abolish it. So certainly, the idea that this is what the Founding Fathers wanted, that this is the way they felt it was best to choose a president. Certainly we've covered some of the logic behind it in terms of the compromise with states, but adhering to the will and the desire of the Founding Fathers. That if we were looking at something like abolishing or significantly changing the Electoral College, that is something that we should take very seriously. Any type of constitutional amendment we should be taking very seriously. Only remove it if something is absolutely indeed broken. And the debate about whether it's broken is quite significant. Certainly the safeguards around against uninformed or uneducated voters, which Dan, I think you talked about a little bit ago. Preventing states with larger populations from having undue influence, on smaller states, and certainly forcing presidential candidates to get out and campaign on a national level, right, to all parts of the country. That isn't perfect by any means, which I'll talk about in a second, but certainly forcing that aspect of it. And providing greater certainty around the outcome. And that might sound odd because a lot of the concern around the Electoral College, of course, is what we've seen in recent years in 2000 and 2016. But the idea that if we didn't have an Electoral College and we had a national popular vote, or we had the presidency decided by a national vote, that would mean that we could potentially have something like 50 Floridas, right? And now where we look at, just for instance, in 2020, where the debate would be, where the legal battles, where the counts of fraud or otherwise that might be leveled. It's isolated to essentially swing states or very, very close margin states at a state level, versus if we had a national vote, we could potentially be litigating, right, and having that degree of uncertainty on a much, much broader scale. So I'll just elaborate a tiny bit more here. So, around the founding fathers, using electors instead of the popular vote was intended to safeguard against uninformed, uneducated voters, putting the final decision in the hands of electors most likely to possess that information. Our society has changed, but many folks still think of the Electoral College, or at least argue that the Electoral College could be used as a safeguard. If you think about in 2016, folks that were very upset or unhappy about a Trump victory, some held their breath, without much hope of it actually happening, but they held their breath that electors could vote a different way because the candidacy of Donald Trump or the presidency of Donald Trump was perceived as being selected by voters that didn't quite understand what they were voting for, right? Or at least not in their best interest. Thinking about ensuring that all parts of the country involved in selecting the president of the United States. If we were looking at just a popular vote, then of course the argument is that we would see campaigning in big cities and in big states, and we'd have rural sections of the country, as Karthick mentioned, right, that would be forgotten and not adhered to, or not in terms of a campaign, not addressed in terms of their issues and their concerns. And then I mentioned the outcome of the election. I think you've already kind of covered that, but the bottom line here is what happens with the Electoral College is fundamentally a political decision. And I know we're going to talk more as we go on in the hour in terms of the current arguments against the Electoral College, but no matter how rational or unrational some of these arguments look like, we understand that politically, this is something that is highly unlikely, right, for us to see. And because of those political calculations and the gaming of what could be possible around the Electoral College, we can't forget, right, that fundamental aspect of the conversation. And I think
Can I get in here? And Dan, Mindy, and Karthick, it's really fascinating. I've been working out of COVID right before the election to the president of my dad's office, and he left me a letter today. And it has a lot to do, Mindy, with some of the points, right, from the founders about this need to have more educated citizens decide and have the power there. And my dad had given me a book around labor organizing. And so what's really important about the Electoral College is that we're unique in Western advanced societies of having a method like this. But where we're not unique, and it comes into, this letter I'm reading, because it was just really astute, which is this idea of communism, that you need this central committee of sorts, because the working class really can't necessarily think of themselves, which is in opposite to democratic socialism, where everybody is able to actually participate and you don't have the centralized committee deciding. And so the Electoral College in some ways is this centralized force that is predicated on some sort of capital or agency that our forefathers did not believe everybody had, most certainly did not believe Black people had it. And I think that that's where it's important is, yes, other countries don't have this, yet this is still very symbolic of a movement towards the end of the 1800s towards communism. So fun fact, I know this is humanities, so we can talk about theory.
No, of course we can, and you're exactly right, Sonja. And I think going back to where the point we were discussing earlier is certainly advances in transportation and communications technology since the late 18th century, lead to a different type of discussion today than back then. But your point about education is a valid one. And when the United States was formed, it was somewhat of an outlier in providing any type of voice for the citizenry as opposed to just the elites. What I hear you saying is whether or not that was the right thing at the time, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're saying perhaps it's time to revisit this given a dramatically different set of circumstances than those that existed when these rules were established. Am I understanding you right? Sonja?
Well, I think that the idea of it and the basis of it, if we think about it, really thinking about race and slavery and this population dynamics is erroneous and so part of our history. And we'll get into what are some of the ramifications or remediations, if you will. To your point about, where we are today because of, the industrial and technology revolutions, I don't think that it matters as much, because the point that I'm trying to make is that though we're distinct in having this type of thinking that the proletariat, that workers were not worthy of their own agency of participating in democracy at the same level as a select educated few, is something that we're tackling today during this pandemic around invisibility and disposability and access to life.
And I may have miscommunicated. My point is that the rationale at the time was that it would be difficult to grant the citizens a direct vote. One, because they didn't have access to immediate information, and second, perhaps because they lacked the education. My point to you, and I think we're saying the same thing in slightly different ways, is one of those dynamics has changed considerably. The other has not, which gets to your point. So let me ask you just one follow-up, and then I want to bring Mindy back in also. Is we talked a little bit earlier about that original compromise between the southern states and the northern states. And we've talked a little bit about how not only the Electoral College, but as you correctly pointed out, our nation's early history was shaped by that dynamic. Talk for a minute, if you can, though, about how those implications of that original agreement, how those are relevant for people of color today.
Yeah, and I'll kick it over to Karthick and Mindy, but essentially it gives an outsized role for very small states that tend to be whiter in comparison to jurisdictions across the South that have large constituencies of Black electorates who were decisive time and time again, but especially this particular election that we just were able to finalize despite massive upheaval and essentially, atrocious rioting. But the ultimate outcome here is that many have argued that the Black vote has been diluted by the Electoral College. And I think empirically people have standing to make that claim. I think another claim that has been made is that the addition of voter suppression and misinformation couples with this Electoral College regime to essentially suppress one person's vote. And this is particular to the Black community, which in many ways is concentrated in urban cores, which despite having similar populations as some of our states, whether it's Nebraska or the Dakotas, don't really have access to a single elector. And what does that mean, right? This is all abstract. It means policy. It means substantive representation. It means being able to have access to a doctor or healthcare to survive a pandemic. And in the past, it meant access to a living wage federal job. So ultimately, elections have consequences. I think we all know that. But what does it mean to have decided our democracy based on this? It really has cemented a devaluation of Black political voice.
Okay. So that leads me to about 45 follow-up questions I'd like to put to you, but I very badly want to make sure that Karthick and Mindy have a chance to weigh in this question also, because I think, at least for the purposes of 1 hour panel, we've covered the history about as much as we can. Hopefully Julia will let us come back for a 6 or 7 hour panel to go into the depth and detail it deserves at some point. But having covered the history, let's turn the conversation to the present day, Karthick, if we can. Sonja talked about how those historical decisions still resonate today. How would you, what would you add to her analysis?
So first of all, I mean, it's absolutely right. I mean, in addition to Black populations, if you look at Latinos and Asians, Asian Americans, for example, tend to be concentrated in safe states, which means that when it comes to presidential elections, part of the reason why they're much less likely to be contacted, in addition to whatever barriers they may face and misconceptions that presidential campaigns may have about what it takes to reach out to them, they're more likely to live in solidly blue states like California and New York, or in red states, although Texas, we'll talk about, maybe we can do an entire hour just on Texas, right? But, I've been doing this for about 20 years and people have been swearing for 20 years that Texas is actually purple and turning blue. I'll believe it when I see it at the presidential level. But, so that's where some of that, it's not an outright legal disenfranchisement, but we know that mobilization matters so much. And so when campaigns just don't even bother to invest, we just know that turnout will be low when that's the case. So I think that's another consequence. One thing I'll add is that it also creates uncertainty and micro populations. Like, why are we paying so much attention to Cubans in Miami-Dade? The reason why we pay attention to Cubans in Miami-Dade is because Florida is this, it's like a perennial either mirage or like this prize that both parties think that they can get, and they spend millions of dollars to try to win Florida. And then you have smaller populations in particular metro areas that, help decide US foreign policy, right, based on trying to go and get that vote. And so there are other kinds of niche populations in some of these larger states where the prizes are so big, where those margins can be consequential. Some people may say that's great. Everyone has a chance, but no, not everyone has a chance. You create this uncertain situation where even if you think about what the Latinx agenda is, how much do we want a particular subset of a population in one state helping to determine what the White House does on a range of policies? I think that's a huge question that we need to ask ourselves, right? So it's breaking down even within communities of color who we're talking about that has outsized influence, and in many ways speak on behalf of the rest of the community.
Well, and Mindy, this gets us back to a question of whether and what type of changes to consider. I think Karthick's point is a very, very smart one. The flip side of it, as I've heard argued by campaign professionals in both parties, is without the Electoral College, a presidential campaign rents an apartment for their candidate in New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, and maybe one or two other cities. And instead of seeing that divide within the states, you see candidates focusing only on those 5 or 6 largest urban areas, which creates another set of divisions. So back to, I'm gonna put you in a difficult spot, because I'd like you to talk, if you can, Mindy, both to the ramifications for communities of color of those original decisions, but also then if you'd be willing to pivot and talk a little bit about what might be required to make changes should it be decided that they're in order. And you'll have to take yourself off mute to do it.
Yeah, it would help if I did that, huh? Well, first, let me, if I may, just kind of switch it a little bit. I mean, I certainly agree with all the comments that have already been made, Sonja and Karthick. And, the way you just presented the argument of, Electoral College versus popular vote, it certainly seems that, right, there's no easy answer to this by any means. But in terms of if there were a change to be made, if change was made, there's two main kind of pathways, and they're both fraught with obstacles and serious controversy in one way or another. And first, it's just certainly changing the Constitution, right? As we said, of course, no easy task, period. There have been many attempts actually over the years, one pretty much right off the bat, after the Electoral College was established by Alexander Hamilton himself. We saw, just as recently as 1969, a serious attempt at abolishing the Electoral College with it passing out of the House, but the bill dying in the Senate. At that time, though, there seemed to be a significant public political, looking at polling even at the time, consensus around moving away from the Electoral College, so that there was an expectation that the state legislatures would ratify what would come out of the House and Senate. To make that change, you have to have a supermajority in the House and Senate, and you have to have 2/3 of your state legislatures to ratify it. That failed in the Senate. Eventually there was, got to, I think it was 1979 with Jimmy Carter's support. There was eventually that vote that happened, but it didn't get to a supermajority. And then fast forward to, of course, 2016, where we saw a ramp up, significant ramp up, 2000, I think even more in 2016, because of the examples that you mentioned earlier, people really wondering, arguing that this is something we have to address. And given the attempts and the great difficulty in getting what is a political process, that political consensus around a constitutional change, looking towards a state way to do it. So much of that conversation has been kind of filtered into the national vote effort. And I can talk a little bit about that as well. So a number of states have signed on to a pact that guarantees that their electoral college votes will go to the winner of the popular vote, regardless, right? No matter what the outcome is of those individual states. We're at 16 jurisdictions, states including DC. I think we're just over 190 states that represent over 190 electoral college votes. Of course, the idea is to get to 270 for it to really have that impact and to go into effect. It would go into effect right at that 270 point. I think even though 2016 was a big push for people to reevaluate this conversation, I'd argue probably why we're even talking about it today, and the concern of what we just went through, right, just a few weeks ago. The fact that it is so closely tied to Donald Trump, in some ways, I would argue, is also a detriment to the conversation, because people see it as so highly politicized around one candidate. That maybe some entities that would support something like a national vote compact or some other approach, hesitate because they see it as a highly divisive, kind of partisan effort. So I think I'll leave it there. But I mean, fundamentally, the reason why many of those, getting back to race, the reason why many of those, actually, I should say, all of the efforts through the years have failed, is largely, or at least in a huge part of this, has been the racial dynamic. So in 1969, largely perceived as the reason why it died in the Senate was because of Southern senators from Southern states that saw the advantage for the white vote, that suppressed the Black vote, the African American vote, and didn't want to lose that advantage. Today, it's very difficult for politicians to change any part of our electoral system if they perceive it as is. They know how to game the system and how to be successful at the system. There are whole machines, right, in each of these swing states, all built around the Electoral College. And so any significant change, I think, through the Congress or through a constitutional amendment, is at least right now still not a viable pathway. And I think I'll leave it there, because I see Sonja wants to jump in too. Please, Sonja.
Yeah,
Sonja, let me ask you this. Mindy talks about some of the practical and political obstacles to making the kind of changes that we've been discussing. Let's posit, just for the sake of argument, that one person on this panel, and I won't say who, would have the power to snap his or her fingers and make the change happen, immediately eliminating those practical and political obstacles that Mindy just outlined. What would the final answer look like? Would it be a straight popular vote?
I think it would be a straight popular vote, and it'd be an and, because what Mindy described was.
I want to hear what you said. You said straight
popular. Oh, I said I think it would be a straight popular vote, but I think that there would be an and. I've, as a seemingly young person but older millennial, I've been struck by the fact that our Constitution had some substantial amendments during the last, what you can say, culture war. And we looked at changing the voting age, to entertaining a myriad of different issues, yet nothing has been done to our Constitution since that time. And it's ripe to deal with the Electoral College. It's been ripe this entire century because of the 2000 election. There's reasons for both, but I think the and too is thinking about the US Senate and apportionment there, and the fact that there is a robust need for some states that have finite populations to continue to yield power and decide public policies for an emerging electorate that tends to be more diverse than any previous generations. So it's not just, to me, Dan, about the Electoral College. It's really rethinking this Constitution, which at its basis was flawed, but was seemingly directed and architected to have changes for which we have not done in generations.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more in that the kind of topics that we're touching on aren't the types of things that lend themselves to a single magic fix. Whether it's the Electoral College, whether it's a changing in voting procedures, it's a much more complicated, multifaceted set of challenges. And I think we're going to go back to Julie Fry, the director of Humanities and California Humanities, and see if we can convince her to let us do a much broader and longer discussion to address these issues in the depth and breadth that they deserve. The Electoral College is too big of an issue to talk about even in 1 hour, Karthick. But because I'm me and you're you and we're friends, we're going to take Sonja's cue and we're going to broaden the discussion anyway. What strikes me, and I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this, is that the discussion of the effect of the Electoral College is at its core an argument about states-based rights and federalism. So I'm wondering if you can take this particular topic and maybe broaden it out even further and talk a little bit about how we should think about federalism and states' rights in this current moment.
Thank you, Dan. There's so many different ways to be thinking about this, but I would say, first of all, let's go beyond the United States. We have history matters and we keep going back to the founders, and I totally get that. But as someone who's an immigrant from India, where you've had some strong kind of state governments and it's a federated system. So I'm not only an immigrant from India, I migrated to Canada before coming to the United States. And arguably there, you also have a pretty strongly federated system as well. And if you look at other federated democracies, they have different ways to try to ensure that it's not just simple majority rule, that minority populations of whatever kinds, their rights are safeguarded. What's interesting is also you have evolution over time. So in India, for example, India has gone through several rounds of reorganization of their states. So the state boundaries that we think of as sacrosanct, other countries have actually broken up states. When you see, and this is not just about the Electoral College, it's also about the US Senate. The kind of overrepresentation Wyoming has to states like California and Texas is it's just way beyond what was true at the time of the founding moment. So I think that there is a way that we can preserve states and provinces and other countries' contexts as the basis for a fair amount of political power, and still ensure more democratic representation. Finally, on this federalism topic, so there's a little bit of a softball that Dan threw to me, because I just came out with this book called Citizenship Reimagined, which talks about us taking a look at state rights, not of the Jim Crow variety, but state-based rights, and to not think about the federal government and the presidency as the only thing that matters when it comes to rights expansion. We see that especially in California with immigrant rights, but also LGBTQ rights, as well as rights of ex-felons, et cetera. There's so many ways that we can think imaginatively, and it's not even fantasy, it's reality in terms of how much states play a role. And then also on the flip side, right? We saw in terms of voting access this time around, thankfully many states expanded access given COVID. If you look at the rhetoric, and the certification of the election prior to the assault on the Capitol, yet Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying that, I hope we get back from whatever these states were doing to expand the franchise. So that's something that I hope that we don't lose the threads when we talk about the Electoral College, regardless of which party you were favoring, that we really take a look at the role that states play in terms of either expanding or contracting rights, including voting rights that are so fundamental. I'm sure there's a lot more we can talk about this, but that's something that weighs heavily on my mind, right? To make sure that we use the Electoral College to open up a much larger conversation about federalism and state-based rights.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think all three of you have made the point in slightly different ways, which is you can't look at any of these issues in a vacuum. And as a couple of you have pointed out, you can't look at them in completely esoteric and philosophical terms either. These are real, we're talking about real people with real needs who deserve the right to have their voices heard. And each of these seemingly arcane discussions can have literally life or death impact on how and when and whether those voices are heard. But Karthick, if you think I was shameless a minute ago, wait until now. Citizens Reimagined, Amazon.com, available on Kindle for $21.02 and paperback, $22.13. It's a little bit too late for the holiday season, but a great gift anyway at any time of the year. All right.
Note to self, I want Dan to do my future communication promotion work.
All right, listen, guys, we've got about 15 minutes left. And if we were to answer every question that has come to us, each question would get 10 seconds answer. So I'm going to rely on our friend Kirsten to rejoin us. And Kirsten, if there are questions in particular that you think, having looked at them more closely than I've had a chance to, that we should definitely address, please do let me know. One that I did notice, which I'll address just as a point of clarity, is one of our audience members asked who the electors are. And what I will tell you is the men and women who comprise the Electoral College are appointed or are nominated by the candidates representing each party in a general election. The popular vote in each state determines which candidates designated electors represent the state at the Electoral College. So not only did Joe Biden appoint electoral representatives in California and elsewhere, so did Donald Trump, so did minor party candidates. And so the electors are designees of the candidates. And while in some states not actually required to vote for the candidate who designated them, in all but the most unusual of circumstances, once their party carries the popular vote in their state, they then cast their electoral vote on behalf of the people of the state. Hence the attempted compromise back in the 18th century between giving the voters themselves all of the vote and none of the vote. This was attempted to be, as we talked about earlier, a compromise. So Kirsten, where do we go from here with our remaining time?
Hi, Dan. Well, it looks as though someone's asking this question: how would it have affected the chances for the survival of the United States as a new nation had the founders just sent the slave states packing?
Boy, fascinating question for anyone who'd like to talk about it. We've talked about the downsides of that compromise, but when you have 13 colonies trying to figure out whether they can unite into a viable nation, the argument can be made that the compromise is both between small states and large states, and southern and northern states was necessary in order for a country to emerge. What do you guys think?
And I think that there's, obviously economic repercussions, right? One of the reasons that the United States of America was able to have this outsized global economy was on the backs of indentured servitude slavery. And so it really was important for this young emerging country to have access to capital that derived from the South. But I think what's also interesting is that the Electoral College wasn't just an issue about slavery at the onset. It also was an issue about Black life again. When we talked about, this compromise of 1876 that occurred when there was a contentious election, allegedly Florida was also in play, but ultimately the electors decided that they would go with the candidate from Ohio over the candidate who won the popular vote in New York. And in doing that, they decided to do that as part of a compromise to end Reconstruction, which was widely seen as a public policy intervention that sought to promote access to opportunity, whether it was political office, business, and the economy, for Black people in this country. And in ending Reconstruction, we quickly as a country pivoted back to a degradation of people through Jim Crow laws. And so, this electoral college is just like rife with racial stories and contentious elections that essentially are happening and being negotiated by people of power and people with means.
Yeah, just a quick addition to that, Dan. I mean, so one way I read that question too, there was a second part to it, which is essentially that if you took, if not race, at least slavery out of the equation, can we talk about the pros and cons of the Electoral College? But unfortunately, because you can think about slavery, I don't know if it's the original sin. I think native genocide is probably ranks up there as well as the kind of original sins of this country. Would you have in something like the Electoral College is essentially giving so much power to states, and then you have to worry about protection of citizenship rights at the state level, right? So time and again, right, you had slavery, then you had the end of Reconstruction, and even now, right, what we saw in Georgia is a decade of work. And just imagine if we had removed all of the barriers and all of the ways that Black voters and other voters of color have been disenfranchised. So there's no way that we can talk about an electoral college that can serve, I don't even know if we can say original intent, because we've talked about even some of that original intent is tainted, but say an intent that is devoid of race. It's going to take a long time for us to get to that kind of principled argument, just sweeping aside. And I think there are other kinds of inequalities, of course, that matter in our country, but there are good reasons why race is so strong, because it's embedded in everything, right? Including even the census count, as we know, right? With the 3/5 compromise is the reason why we asked the race question from the first census.
And as each of you have pointed out, this might be a component of addressing a broader set of challenges, but only one single component of it. It's interesting to me listening to each of you talk about this, because one of the things that I hear in contemporary America, so many citizens, so many of my students criticize about politics is the horse trading, the deal making. So you get to Sacramento, you get to Washington, you get to City Hall, and you have to trade things away. And what I hear each of the three of you saying in different ways is, of course, this is nothing new either. In order to get a portion of what you want, it means giving away something of what you want. And the fundamental question, which each of you posed in a slightly different way, is what's so important that you can't trade away? What's so important that you shouldn't ever, ever trade away? And what do you then compromise in order to achieve those ultimate goals and priorities? And what I've heard all three of you say in different ways is what would be defined as an ultimate priority in 2021 is far different than the way it would have been defined by our founders in the late 18th century.
One quick thing I'll say, Dan, just briefly, one sentence is, let's make sure that the 14th Amendment is robustly enforced to fulfill its promise.
Okay.
That I think would solve a lot of the kind of problems. There are other problems, of course, that will still remain.
Little obscure, but for those of you who have not followed it recently, the third provision of the 14th Amendment says that by a majority vote of Congress, a departed president can never run for office again. And so on the off chance that you're referring to current events.
I'm not referring to current events, but
Mindy,
I meant voting rights and other citizenship
Mindy,
rights.
we're running a little bit low on time, but I want to make sure you get a chance to weigh in on this because it's such an important question.
Well, you just got me thinking additionally a little bit. You were talking about our values, right? And who we are as a nation. First off, I don't know if we really are that different in many ways, fundamentally, in 2020 than we were at the founding of our nation. I think we still, as Karthick referred a little while ago, I mean, we're still a racist nation. And we have we have a terrible history, but we see it still today taking place all around us, vestiges of the past, but also being recreated and reestablished all the time. And certainly when we look at current forms of voter suppression and manipulation of the electoral system, right, to the severe disadvantage of historically underrepresented groups. So, but I was just thinking that also speaks to the comment about if we had traded away think that was the question. Sorry, the part of the question about trading away or giving up a relationship with slave states. Back to our values. I don't think that would have, it's a complicated story, right? And there's a lot of historical text, right, that it addresses that. But I think fundamentally it just speaks to our values as a nation there that we made that compromise. It comes down to that and who we are. So,
and I think that's so important. That's so important, Mindy, about thinking through the value of work, because it's both a question about political values and societal values as it is about the economy. And I think fundamentally it's a false choice to think that we cannot actually provide people with a living wage, or at that period, any sort of employment and dignity. And I think so much about the pandemic that we're in right now and the atrocious numbers that are disconcerting and making Los Angeles the epicenter of COVID-19, and one can argue the Northern Hemisphere. And this is a racialized pandemic whereby we just expect many of us of means and privilege to continue on in our lives at the expense of people who in many ways are seen as disposable or invisible. And these are frontline essential workers. And many of them are also the same underrepresented groups that you've spoken about, Mindy, that face the most tremendous barriers to the franchise. And many times are very purposeful, if not just intentionally misguided.
In just a minute, in just a couple minutes, we're going to turn this into a more casual conversation. And that way our listeners who've had to depend on me to bring out your guys' smartest thinking are going to have a chance to do so for themselves. But before I give up this sole ownership of this microphone, I'd like to ask you guys one other question, because I don't know that we'll get a chance to get to it before at least some of our group starts to dissipate. You know, as you've correctly pointed out, these aren't partisan questions. These are questions about human rights, about human values, about making sure that everyone has a chance to have their voice heard and their rights respected in society today. So for those who are not going to be able to stay around for the whole more informal conversation, what advice would you offer to someone who's been part of our group today listening to this really smart conversation about what they can do to help move this conversation forward in a productive way in the direction that you've all talked about? How does a smart, well-meaning person get involved in helping us work toward these goals? What can we tell them?
One, I'll just tee it off, and would love to hear others' thoughts as well. I think keeping in mind what Mindy had said at the jump, to say you can't ignore the politics and how difficult it is to do. I think these kind of, conversations, the kind of impatience or the kind of frustrations, I think are important because they reveal kind of an important window into what is not working. And even if it's impossible to change the Electoral College, I think we can start talking about other kinds of electoral reforms. If not for the vote for president, things like instant runoffs, other kinds of proportional representation in state legislatures, things that other countries have done. I mean, to me, it's just fascinating for a country that was revolutionary and thinks of itself as at the forefront of innovation in so many ways. It's just very fascinating that when it comes to our political systems and processes, we like innovation in small doses, and we're really holding on to things that might have outlived their value a long time ago. So some of the things we're talking about, if we do want to make sure that rural interests are better protected, other kind of minority interests are better protected, there are other tools we can use, but there just seems to be a deep reluctance to even entertain it in any serious way, to implement it at a local level or even at a state level. So I hope that we can imagine bigger and dream bigger, because I think that's the first step we need to do to enact reforms.
Can jump in. Do we still have time? We have time? Okay. I guess what I would say is, I was tasked, my question, of course, was to talk about all the reasons why to keep it, right? But I absolutely agree with Karthick that whatever the likelihood is, that doesn't mean, right, we can say this about a lot of important topics, it doesn't mean that we stop the conversation, and these conversations can be so vitally important, especially with regard to other types of reforms. So our electoral system, period, not electoral college, but electoral system in the United States is one, there's lots of things that we should be really reviewing. The system is one that disadvantages, yes, historically underrepresented groups, but it also serves to, in many other ways, discourage people from participating, right? A winner take all districts, single member, dominant two parties, the very few really truly competitive races, the power of incumbency and very few competitive races. We really have an electoral system that people wonder why, they feel like there's not much of a impact that they have with their single vote. And they're looking outside of the United States to other systems, right? Multi-party systems and other options that are there. Can tell us a lot about the limitations of certainly of where we're at. Now, going back to the likelihood of seeing that sort of change, for all the reasons why I mentioned earlier, it's a hard sell just to get simple reforms like automatic voter registration and expanding access to vote by mail, for God's sakes, because everyone is gaming the system around that. But there are bigger questions ultimately that we should be talking about, along with the Electoral College, about the structure of our system, how it disproportionately disadvantages groups, advantages other groups, and ultimately really suppresses. I mean, the two-party system essentially came out of, right, the establishment of the Electoral College. And sometimes that's one of the reasons why it's cited, people cite for keeping the Electoral College, because it gives us a two-party system which is stable and gives us a stable democracy. So you can look at it lots of different ways. I see a two-party system, largely a two-party system in terms of how we function, as one that ends up really ultimately suppressing our vote and people's sense of saliency and urgency around the voting process. But
let's come back. Let's come back to the two-party question in just a minute, because I think it's a really interesting one and a really important one. Sonja, since you drew the short straw and go third on this question, I'm going to put you in the unenviable position of sharpening the question that Karthick and Mindy just answered. Given everything they've said, I agree with, I assume you do too, how do you make that happen? How do you make those things happen? What are the practical steps that need to happen for people participating in this conversation to help us heading down the type of road that Karthick and Mindy have laid out for us?
I think you build power, and you build power through organizing, and that takes conversations, and that takes really engaging in awareness and educational opportunities that do not have to be in an ivory tower, but in fact can be at your workplace, in your homes, online, but hopefully not online in the way that we saw happen last week, but thinking through places with verifiable information. And unfortunately, so many Americans are at a disadvantage, even preparing for this webinar. I mean, there was so much to be said about the Electoral College in terms of academics, pundits, experts, you name it, that refuse to acknowledge the centrality of slavery and race. And so in dismissing that, we have a harder time finding common ground as to why we want to move forward. I think to Mindy's comment, and President Obama had said this after Donald Trump was elected, which is that, he has hope in the American people that there are more similarities than there are differences. And if I think about public opinion polling, where I find support for that is that Americans want good jobs and they want access to healthcare. They really believe in a future and an opportunity. And if able to do that, I do think that the popular vote is an avenue for that. It is an avenue to affirm public policy decision-making and substance in a way that we really, frankly, have not had because of the Electoral College, in addition to other systems. So Mindy's point about structures and systems, how do you do this, right? The day-to-day, you build power, you have conversations. You have conversations with people that know different things, have different lived experiences. and you continue those conversations. It's about retention and it's about a commitment to that. I mean, we're celebrating MLK weekend, and Coretta Scott King, something that Kamala Harris always says is that civil rights are a battle for each and every generation.
Sonja, you use out of that entire excellent answer, there's one word that you mentioned that I want to italicize, capitalize, and underline, and that's retention. It's really, really easy the day after an election, particularly one, whether it's a local campaign for city council or for president of the United States, it's really easy to walk away and say, okay, I'm done. And for those of you, who were listening carefully to all three of our panelists, what they said much more politely than I'm about to is not a chance. The work doesn't end on election day. That's when the work begins. I tell my students that politics is too important to be left to the politicians. And that if you cast a ballot like a good citizen should, and then go away the next day and think you're done until 2 years later, you're letting people who don't necessarily have your best interests at heart make all the most important decisions about your interests. And that's not fair to you. And what Mindy, what Karthick, what Sonja have all told you guys in very different ways is the way this change happens is by not so much getting involved, but by staying involved, by retaining that level of involvement and engagement. Karthick, I want to ask you, because we have a couple of other really neat questions come in. Question I'd like to put to you is, are there lessons we can learn, I'm talking structurally, from other countries in the way they run their systems? In other words, we've talked about the US in the 1800s and the United States in 2021. Has anyone over those 240 plus years made any decisions on how to run their elections that we could learn some lessons from?
I mean, absolutely, right. And I think, and so the short answer is yes, right? So especially, I mean, there have been waves of this, especially with the fall of the former Soviet Union. You have political science research, and a lot of consultants and advisors helping countries set up systems. And one of the big debates in political science at the time was, should you really be setting up presidential systems? Because it seems to have worked all right in the United States. But in many other countries, including countries in Latin America, strong presidential systems have not meant long-term stability for representative democracy. So you had a fair number of political science research suggesting that parliamentarian systems, and also thinking about party systems as separate from presidential versus parliamentary, as something to look at as well. Mindy had mentioned proportional representation, which is easier in parliamentary systems than in the kind of presidential systems we're talking about. So yes, absolutely. The thing I'll say from what Mindy had said earlier, it doesn't surprise me at all that the last major push for this was in 1969. That was coming out of a very broken Democratic Convention in 1968, and a kind of revolutionary moment, if you will, where social movements, including the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, LGBT rights, so many other rights were being pushed simultaneously that people thought, and you had that kind of big demographic kind of push of the baby boom generation coming to power, thinking that now is the time. As many different folks have said, crises can be important moments that allow for reforms to happen that might have been unthinkable. But I think that's much easier to envision. For example, COVID has caused such a rupture that it's changing our assumptions and the ways that we design transportation, the way we design work, so many different things. Our political system has changed somewhat. You've seen some of these states that have made it easier to vote by mail than they had in the past. But I think these other fundamental reforms, I think most of us, I'll just say personally, what happened on January 6th, it really, it's so difficult to be resilient when having gone through something like that. I think many of us, I'll just say, speaking for me personally, that day almost broke me by the end of that day. I'm hoping that we don't forget the lessons of what that means and how we need to reform so many aspects of our systems, electoral systems, political systems, media systems. We talked about this a little bit, Dan, when you had teed it up. What does it mean when we have concentration of informational power in a few firms in digital media? And should we take comfort knowing that a company like Twitter can turn the spigot on and off in terms of what a political official can do without having that democratic accountability for those decisions? I think these are huge, huge questions that we should be open with an innovation mindset, not only what's happened in the last 200 something years, but even the kinds of things that are happening in the private sector under the realm of governance that we should be thinking about our political system and how it needs to respond to this moment.
I think there are several good points, and there are excellent points, Karthick, each one of which is worthy of another Cal Humanities discussion program. But I think your point about January 6th is a particularly important one. And as we wrap up, I'd love to hear Mindy and Sonja on this also. I'll offer you this. I look at the US Capitol now as a metaphor for our democracy. It's a lot more vulnerable than we thought it was. And it's been badly damaged. But it's survived. And while repairs are gravely necessary to make it work the way it's supposed to again, I think we have to fully understand the extent of the damage we have done to its infrastructure before we can move forward and repair it. And the carpenters, the electricians, that's the easy part on a physical structure. What you guys are talking about is the very foundations of a democracy. And if you're going to fix a democracy that has been damaged but not destroyed, it requires every single one of us, regardless of racial, ethnic, religious, urban, rural, gender identity, any other type of background, to decide that we have a stake in that ultimate outcome.
I think that's what they call a mic drop, Dan, that you just did to us. So thank you.
I'm good. I have enough faith in Mindy, Romero, and Sonja Diaz that before we call it a day, not just one of them, but both of them can offer something on this particular topic. Let's call it post-January 6th America, that Karthick can put both you and me to shame. So.
Talk about pressure, Dan.
I'll put the question in a more fair way, Mindy, Sonja. Obviously, the immediate death toll was infinitesimal compared to September 11th, 2001. But in some ways, the events of January 6th, I would argue, had a similar effect on our collective consciousness. Mm-hmm. What do you take away from those riots, from that tragedy? And what are the steps we need to move forward? Not just, here's the easy part, not just to condemn the criminals deservedly, but how do you reach out to those misguided people who disagree with us peacefully? Get this all back together.
So I think that alone, right, we could talk for hours and hours on. I'll just give you some, I guess, first thoughts that I have. A moment ago, I was talking about people need to know that their vote matters, right? And that there's a saliency and urgency to the electoral process. Why should I go out and do that, especially if I have to leave my kids with a babysitter or I'm working 2 jobs or whatever it might be. But intertwined in all of that is people having information and knowledge around how the system works and having trust and faith in the system, that their vote isn't, as we've seen in this last election, that their vote isn't going to be stolen from them. Their vote by mail ballot isn't going to be thrown away. But fundamentally, people need to trust the system to decide whether they're even going to participate in it, right? And we have a long history in this country with many groups that have, many reasons, right? Much evidence to rationally not trust the electoral system, right? Voter suppression of African Americans in the South, as we've already talked about, for instance. Where do we go from here? I think we are at a dangerous point where there is, just coming out of the election before even, of course, January 6th, we have so many Americans that don't know. We saw incredibly high turnout, which is a bright light for me. But I think we're at a crossroads here. What do we do? Will those people come back to the election? This is a unique set of circumstances in terms of amping up the saliency. But I think a lot of people voted and didn't know whether that vote was going to count. And now they're being told after the fact that that vote didn't count, that their vote was stolen, not knowing if they can trust their own, state election officials. So we have a lot of work just to educate and build trust around how the system functions, like this, that sort of thing, right? And then more broadly, we have a fractured society in so many ways, and just saying we're going to come together and heal isn't going to cut it. And I know that now, as of tomorrow, our President Biden will do all that he can. He's already said he will, in terms of trying to create some sort of healing and some sort of coming together. But we have to address all of the misinformation. We have to address the mechanisms that cause that. We are going to have to address the fact that Donald Trump is still going to be in the picture. And of course, he didn't start this and he's not going to finish it. I don't want to take time away from Sonja, so sorry, but it's going to be a long road ahead, I think, and I fear. But I am encouraged by seeing such a strong reaction to what happened on January 6th. If I didn't see that, if Karthick, it didn't almost break you, and so many other people that I talked to, would be even greater trouble. What I am concerned is all the public opinion polls that I'm seeing that is showing this big divide in how people are viewing you and me. I think all of us are devastated by what we saw on January 6th, but there's a lot of the public who think that what happened on January 6th is wrong, but they see it still very differently in terms of who caused it, in terms of what's at play, in terms of whether Trump should even be part of the blame, and who still very much agree that the election was stolen. So there's not a uniform reaction to what happened, what we saw on January 6th, and that's something we have to reckon with. Sorry, Sonja, is taking so much time.
Well, just 2 points. The first is positioning January 6th in the long legacy of state-sanctioned racial terror. Whether you're looking at Rosewood, you're looking at Tulsa, you're looking at Greensboro, this is not new. And that includes the complicit nature of our law enforcement within these actions. The second thing is that there's precedents elsewhere. And if we think about Truth and Reconciliation, you can think about South Africa, you can think about others. You can think about the New Germany and the ways in which they pay homage to a history, however negative. And that's something we simply have not done in this country. We have not faced the reckoning of slavery, of genocide, in any way that really puts us on a course towards transformation. And until that happens, we're going to be refilling failed systems. And that's an atrocity and a poor use of our time and the innovation that allegedly is unique to California and to the United States. So I think that there needs to be a true reconciliation process that has to be historically accurate. And without that, I don't know that we're going to fully see systems that work for everybody and a decrease to this polarization.
Well, you mentioned lessons from other countries. You mentioned South Africa. There's a famous quote from Mandela: if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner. But I think what's so important about your point, Sonja, is reconciling doesn't mean pretending. And reconciling requires an appraisal of what got us, what's gotten us to a particular point if we're going to move forward from it. I would, if it were up to me, take this conversation forward and go well into the evening, if not to breakfast. But my friend Julie Fry would kill me.
Oh my God, Dan, is this your version of a nightclub? Zoom?
This is a super nerd humanistic nightclub. Exactly right. No, and I think our audience would agree with me that listening to the three of you has really been just a phenomenal, it's been a wonderful experience. And even though I can't extend it any further, I know I speak on behalf of all of our guests and our entire audience by thanking all three of you, not just for the time and the wisdom and the insight you've given us today, but for all the good work you do on behalf of these causes all day, every day. Sonja, Diaz, so Mindy, Romero, so Karthick, Ramakrishnan, please, we thank you very, very much. And then panelists and audience alike, I hope you'll join me in thanking Julie Fry and Kirsten Vega and the entire team at Cal Humanities. Their mission, as all of you know, is to connect Californians to ideas in one another, to understand our shared heritage and diverse cultures, inspire civic participation, and shape our future. And we might not have finished that job tonight, but thanks to my friends Karthick and Mindy and Sonja, we took a very, very important step in that direction. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again for similar programming in the future. Have a great night, and everyone, tomorrow, enjoy our democracy. You deserve it.
Stay safe, everybody.